Who are the Covenant's most dangerous criminals ever? And how are Covenant traitors treated in Covenant prisons? Well, here is pretty much everything we know about that subject. A lot of cool stuff we're going to talk about today. Let's jump into it. This video is supported by Audible. Snag yourself a free Halo audiobook right down in the description below. Let's discuss how the Covenant dealt with its criminals, but actually what was considered crimes during the pursuit of the Great Journey. Mostly things you would think, like theft, assault, piracy, and of course, murder, desertion, treason obviously being an instant death sentence, much like the Heretic. Although some criminals, like the Dom, did not actually commit a traditional crime of sorts, rather he just failed at his job, failed expectations of the prophets, which were pretty high, which might as well be a sentence to death in many situations. Although really anything that offends or disappoints those in power got the axe. There was actually a maximum security Sinkili prison named Weeping Shadows of Sorrow, which we'll talk about more in a sec, which was also located on a desolate world. Prisoners held here were put behind energy shield doors and would only have freedom to leave for exercise periods, allowing some degree of free roaming, which often was the perfect opportunity for the elites to attack each other. As for human prisoners, almost every single Halo game has some similar sort of prison for human prisoners. As we can see like in Halo 1 when we saved the guys, or Sergeant Johnson when he was thrown in that little barbaric prison by the Brute, and so on. On Covenant ships, it seems that in most cases, prisons have these energy barriers, whereas the one on High Charity have bars, like human prisons have, and evidently criminals of each species were separated by race. When it came to human prisoners, almost every single Covenant species, especially the Brutes, would eat them. Also, if you don't know, Brutes are, savages, and they are willing to eat just about anything that includes humans, but also pretty much all the Covenant species, which also includes elite criminals and probably all other species in the Covenant, including other Brutes. Drones and grunts were also often used to be a workforce in the Covenant, being forced to mine, dig, and serve the Covenant's large demand for fuel and other resources for the human Covenant war. In many cases, these labor camp prisons were actually comprised of mentally unstable individuals, as the Covenant saw them as unfit for frontline duties, and they were probably right. Although the Covenant would often exile these individuals that they saw as freaks or unmutuals, and even just kill the incapable individuals on the spot. The ones that were left capable in some sense, willing to do work and stuff like that, they were certainly still very dangerous, and we saw that when Black Team ran into a drone prison camp labor thing that just went completely nuts. Sometimes even the strongest or luckiest of the Covenant, or even most loyal, like during the Battle of Hierophant that killed millions of Covenant in one day, the survivors would be rewarded publicly, then swiftly murdered behind the scenes soon after. And I don't think that was the first nor last time that they did that. It was also too often that the prophets would punish or kill off any potential threats of power. One notable example being the Imperial Admiral that was the largest elite alive, and he was basically regarded as the king of the Covenant, having control of pretty much the entire Covenant army, aside from the prophets, which some disregarded entirely. He was very successful, very loyal, and he was deemed as the true leader. However, the hierarchs found him as a threat and demoted him and his forces to a desolate spot in space, way far from the front lines or anything that's relevant. Post-human Covenant war, Brutes were often hunted down by these vengeful elites angry about the Great Schism and the lie of the Great Journey, right? And some of these Brutes were forced to do menial labor, such as gardening for the elites on Sinkilios, believe it or not. Brutes that tore off Marines' heads and ate them in front of their friends are now probably doing gardening on Sinkilios. And lower tier species like grunts, Kegyar, and drones were often used, abused, and told what to do. Often prisoners would simply be killed off if not useful. But ultimately, under a certain light, all of High Charity was a prison based off force and lies. Now let's talk about individual criminals in the Covenant. The first one, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with, is Reba Momee, the Arbiter seen in Halo Wars 1. Well, if you don't know, he was actually a criminal at one point, and a pretty dangerous one, and he was held at the prison that we discussed earlier, the Weeping Shadows of Sorrow. As shown in Halo Genesis, an official comic issue, Reba was pretty good at putting down rebellions in the Covenant. Eventually, he would stage a coup of his own on his own Sinkili clan leader as an attempt to grab at power, and instead was judged by the High Council as a traitor and was sentenced basically life in prison. Once at the maximum security prison, Reba was harassed by others in his clan because of his dishonor that he brought, and eventually he got them to attack the guards and tried to escape, and he almost made it. However, he was recaptured and heavily beaten. However, it was at this time that humanity became a threat to the Covenant at the beginning of the war. Thus, the High Prophet of Regret decided to use Momee as a powerful weapon, as he was very persistent and very powerful, very strong, and appointed him as the Arbiter and pardoned him of his crimes. Reba was pretty skilled, and when enraged, he could muster some amazing speed and strength for an elite. Although he let his guard down and was killed by Forge in Halo Wars rather easily, so his ego got the best of him. He otherwise was a pretty dangerous foe though. Also, he was really into a choking fetish. Pataki was one dangerous Sanshayom soldier, as he was technically a Covenant Spartan, aided by augmentations, mental and physical, and had a suit full of abilities and functions for fighting, much like a UNSC Spartan. After the Human Covenant War, Tim and a surviving minister, a Sanshayom, plotted revenge against the Sinkili for betraying the Covenant, failing to protect High Charity from the flood, and likely his family dying. They intended to use a Halo prototype ring and transport it to the elite's homeworld and fire, killing all life in the solar system, including of course on Sinkilios. Eventually, Tim failed in a duel and was placed in a holding cell on the Shadow of Intent. Eventually, he did escape and destroyed the ring himself, now injured and his family dead. Despite his rather pathetic ending, he overall was an absolute badass and villain, and he got pretty close to killing millions of innocent Sinkili, including many Covenant loyalists. Although he technically isn't a Covenant criminal, he did intend to try to kill millions of Covenant, right? So it seems like he would have been a criminal if his plan did work. And of course, Atriox had to be mentioned in this video. He's easily one of the most dangerous criminals that the Covenant has ever had. He has the might of a brute. He's also taller than most brutes, probably stronger too, but also has the intelligence, the cleverness, and has a whole following, so he has leadership skills. He hated the Covenant, he didn't believe in the Great Journey, and he really hated the Prophets, as they sent him and his clan carelessly to break the front lines until eventually they tried to banish him, in which he revolted and grew a clan of his own. Like many other Covenant criminals, he didn't believe in the Great Journey, and actually thought of the genocide of humanity as pretty stupid and petty. What made Atriox so powerful was his ability to thrive as a leader of an underdog group, and unlike the Covenant, he actually treated his troops with respect. So not only was he physically dangerous, but he could have easily had, if not will, a massive following as large as the Covenant. The most notable criminal is easily Thel the Dom, or aka the most recent Arbiter. We know all about him, so I'll keep this section brief. He basically lost a ship named Ascendiate Justice around Halo 1 to Master Chief and other forces, which eventually helped destroy the Covenant's Earth invasion, the Hierophant, right? Delaying the invasion by like a month, killing millions of Covenant in the process. In addition, the Arbiter failed to stop Chief from destroying the ring in Halo 1, their holy relic, all leading him to basically being judged as a heretic of sorts, thus being punished to be the Arbiter, basically a shameful rank, right? However, during this cutscene in particular, we can see the wild Kig-Yar biting at the bars, obviously indicating these Kig-Yar are also criminals. It was alluded in this cutscene by the Brute here that Covenant soldiers would often dispose criminals by feeding them to Kig-Yar convicts who would eat them alive. Another famous criminal was a heretic, or his real name Sisa Refumi, but he really had a whole following of traitors. The heretic, as we learned about in Halo 2, had a great following and caught enough attention by the High Council to enact the Arbiter again. Unlike others so far, we actually get to fight the heretic in Halo gameplay, and he wasn't terribly powerful, but I think what made him so dangerous was that he knew the truth and he actually started a following, which it really didn't get as far as this in many cases throughout the 3,000 year or so history of the Covenant. Covenant. He knew the true nature of the Flood, the Halo Rings, and all this truth could easily dismantle the Covenant. In fact, it was sort of dismantling the Covenant, and somewhat later on, during the Great Schism amongst Covenant separatists, he really started a following that I think seeded the Arbiter to do what he did in Halo 2 and 3. One notable example I've talked about before is Faul Javamay. Prior to the Human Covenant War, Faul was a powerful leader in his clan. Although his respect in the Covenant was very high, he refuted to take on the Covenant's religion as his own or validate it at all, refusing to accept what he didn't believe. His wife was killed. And so with this story in mind, I think that this was often the example when if you did not openly believe and say that you believe in the Great Journey and stuff, this was seen as heresy, as treasonous, that basically it was a middle finger to the entire Covenant. So of course the prophets would always kill ruthlessly anyone that stood in the way, anyone that said that the Great Journey was a lie. The Covenant sent assassins after Faul and even a Covenant force, but none proved skill enough to kill him until Haka, a member of his own clan, came to kill him and was successful during a duel. But because of Faul's actions, it had led to all future Arbiters change from a glorious honorable rank to a shameful disgrace, one that would result in death by a suicide mission for the good of the Covenant, in which Faul Javamay, 100 years later, would become one as well. Ironically, probably the most dangerous criminals in the Covenant are those of the leaders themselves: truth, mercy, and regret. They rose to power through manipulation, blackmail, and eventually became the chosen ones, the prophets. By knowing the truth that humanity was the true reclaimers, the Great Journey chosen ones, right? They would have to cover this up, right? So they ended up poisoning the hearts and the minds of billions of Covenant members, of which many, many millions, maybe billions of Covenant members died, and ultimately ended in High Charity falling to the Flood. In fact, San Shyom that fled during the collapse of the Covenant at the end of the Human Covenant War were due to them being killed off by angry ex-members that felt betrayed and angry at the lies. Ultimately, these three douchebags ended up manipulating the entire Covenant to having millions and millions die and do much more damage than humanity could have ever done upon the Covenant. These guys screwed over 100+ generations of aliens trying to reach a holy place. Like this video up if you ended up enjoying, as every single like really does help out my content. It shows YouTube's system that this video is worth watching for other Halo fans. Also, quick question, have you ever wondered what the Covenant's take on Spartans are? Well, I made a full video on that, so definitely check it out down below or right here if you're interested in watching that. And thank you guys so much for watching today's video. Subscribe and hit that notification bell to join me on this great Halo journey. Alright, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.